I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's class on chess tactics. We've been going through, all my examples are taken from the book The Game of Chess by Tarrasch. It was written in 1935. Tarrasch was a world champion contender. He didn't win the match. He played Emanuel Lasker. He lost, but he was a great player. He's a German. He was an amateur. He was a MD by profession. He had a medical practice. Anyway, he wrote a great book, and I take my examples from his book. We're almost finished with all the middle game examples, so tonight will be the last set of examples from his book. This is the first one we're going to go over. Tonight's topic, well, we have a few topics, only a few examples each topic. The first topic is this position, and it is that you can advance pawns. So by advancing pawns against the enemy king or queen position, in this case it's not a win, but black can save the game by advancing his pawns in counterattack against white. So before we go into the moves, let's look at the position a little bit. You'll notice right off the bat that white has a bishop stuck down black's throat on the d6 square. It's supported by a pawn on e5, and that's supported by a pawn on f4. White's queen is in an aggressive position. It is blocked by the pawn on c6, though. And white's rooks, one's on d2, protecting the bishop. The other one's on f1. It can move over to that open file by rook to d1. Counting the pawns, each side has 2, 4, 6, 7 pawns. So the pawn forces are even. 2 rooks, bishop, and a queen. Notice that the bishops are different colors. The black bishop's on a white square, and the white bishop's on a black square. Does anyone in the audience know what that's referred to in chess? It's called bishops of opposite colors. Now, the interesting thing about bishops of opposite colors is they often lead to a drawn game. And the reason they do, the white bishop can only move on black squares, and conversely, the black bishop can only move on white. So white can basically attack black squares using his bishop, and he can be supported by the rooks and queen. The bishop can be. Conversely, black can only attack white squares. Because both sides are attacking different squares, the attacks and defenses tend to balance out. If both bishops were in the same color square, you might trade them off, and then it wouldn't be so many drawn games. Okay, so right off the bat, you see white has more space. In chess, space is the number of squares you can move your pieces to, and we say control when you can move your pieces to squares and the opponent can't oppose them. So see the white bishop on d6, there's no piece that can take it. It's protected by a pawn, so a rook can't take it without losing a rook for a bishop, and a rook's worth 5 pawns or 5 points, and a bishop is worth 3 pawns or 3 points. So a rook taking that bishop, even if they get the pawn, the bishop and pawn would be 4 and the rook would be 5. That would still be advantageous to white. So basically that bishop on d6 is immune to capture. It's very strong. The fact that it's on the 6th row, see how it breaks black's position to the queen side and king side. Black has a hard time defending. Black's queen is pretty well placed. Notice that the black bishop on the white square is blocked by a pawn on c6 and a pawn on f5. And see how most of black's pawns are white squares. When you play chess in endings, it's bad for your bishop, in this case black's bishop on a white square, to have your pawns on the same color square, they get in the way of moving your bishop around the board. They block it. Now, white has, see, in white's case, he has 4 pawns on black squares. But the big difference between white and black is white's bishop is in front of his pawns, and black's bishop is behind the pawns. So the bottom line is, even though the material is even, white has a big positional advantage. Black is defending. Black would be very happy to get a draw out of this game. Now the question is, it's black's move. How can black get a counterattack going and save the game? Now the topic is advanced pawns. Let's look at the black pawns. What's the most advanced pawn for black? Would anyone care to hazard? Which pawn is most advanced?
H4.
H4, you're right. So that's the pawn that we're thinking about. So given that as background, what do you think is black's best move in this position?
H3.
Yes, H3. Now let's look what that does. The H3 black pawn attacks that pawn on G2. Notice that when the pawn was on H4, it was on a black square. Now it's on a white square. It's attacking the pawn on G2. Now, if white moves the pawn on G2, let's say pawn takes pawn, black can't take it back right away, but it opens up that diagonal for the white queen and the king. And if the bishop on D7 can move to, if that pawn on C6 can move up 1 square, and the bishop can go bishop to C6, it'll pin the white queen against the king. This is the basis of black's counterattack. That's why H3 is such a good move. It messes up black's kingside pawn position. Well, let's see what white does. White didn't take the pawn. See, white didn't want the pawn there where it could be attacked by the black rook, and then the rook, both rooks might line up on the rook file. A rook could take the pawn, and then the rook would be attacking the pawn in front of the king. Black would probably win the game. So white played a defensive move, keeping his pawns intact and leaving the black rook blocked by his own pawn that's now on H3. Okay, now black moved his bishop to E6, where it attacks that white pawn on C4. The white pawn can't move up 1 square because the bishop could go to D5 and pin the queen, and white would have to give up the rook. Rook takes bishop to save his queen. Anyway, white chose to move his queen to C3 where it defends the pawn, so that's a pretty simple maneuver. Now black's going to double rooks. See, when black moved his bishop to E6, that freed up the square that the rook just moved to. Then the other rook can come over, possibly. Anyway, that black rook on D7, it's a very strong defensive position. So let's go on. White doubled rooks on the D file, reinforcing his advanced bishop. Now black advanced the pawn to C5. He opens up the white diagonal toward the white king, and he might be able to play queen to C6 check. Then the queen working down to G2, that would be checkmate, protected by that advanced pawn. White would always have to keep a rook or some piece watching this square, so it ties white's pieces down and keeps white from winning the game, actually. White moves the king over so that there's no check on that diagonal. Black doubles rooks. white moves queen to a3. What is white's threat now? Say white had an extra move. What would his next move be? Anyone in the audience care to hazard a guess?
Perhaps take the pawn and ball check. C5.
You could do that. He can't do it right away, though, because it would be queen takes. Well, if queen takes check, queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, it would open up the two rooks against the rook down here on d2, and black would win a rook.
Right.
Yeah, but white is trying to threaten to take that pawn in the future, but he can't take it right away. Black moves his pawn up. When the pawn was on a7, the queen was attacking the pawn. Black wants to be able to move his queen away from protecting the pawn, so by moving the pawn up where to one square, it's protected by the pawn on b7, that will allow black to move his queen away in the future. Remember, black wants to move the queen here, but he doesn't want to lose the pawn by queen takes pawn, so he moves it here first. Okay, let's see what white does. Oh, white took the pawn. Okay, black can't win the rook because his queen's attacked by the bishop. So if black does rook takes rook, the answer is not bishop takes queen, it's rook takes rook. Then he's threatening the queen. So that's where the queen wanted to move anyway. He wanted to go to c6. So now he's pointing toward the king, and if that rook were to move away from d2, the move would be queen to g2 would be a checkmate. See how the advanced pawn gives the queen a square to checkmate the white king? That's the advantage of having an advanced pawn against your opponent's king position. White has to keep a rook on d2 no matter what, or one of his other pieces. Okay, white moves his bishop up. He won the pawn. Now he moves his bishop back where it was. He doesn't want to trade off the rooks. He hopes to attack with the rooks in the future, and see how the two black rooks are blocked with no place to move by the bishop. Black moved his pawn up from f7 to f6. He wants to trade some pawns and try to break up the pawn chain that's blocking all black's moves. And by moving the pawn here, it lets the rook go over to the h-file as a possibility in the future. Black's threatening pawn takes pawn. And white actually now offers his rook. He's offering to lose the rook, so bishop takes rook, but that might not be so good for black because the pawn would take, and then the pawn would threaten pawn takes queen, and notice that the c file is open, and the rook could move to c1 in the future. Couldn't do it right away because the queen's there, but when the rook went to c1, it would attack the king and queen on the same file. But before white could play rook to c1, he'd have to move this pawn here so the queen would protect the rook. So black's probably not going to take, well, he did take it. Okay, I was thinking, and white took back with the bishop. I was thinking taking back with the rook. So let's take a look at this and see why he didn't take with the pawn. Okay, let's see what black does. Okay, now black is feeling, anyway, it's black's move. Who sees the threat for, what would white's next move be? If black has to defend, what would white's winning move be if he could move two moves in a row? Anyone in the audience care to hazard?
Bishop takes, or rook takes
Well, let's look at white's. White has a threat. What would white's move be if white could move again? What is his threat in this position?
Rook C5.
Pinning the queen to the king. Black has to stop that threat, and he felt compelled to give back the exchange by rook takes. Now, white could try rook to c5, but it doesn't work out too well for him. Let me call my notes up here. Oh, yeah. So I actually don't have a note on it, but rook to c5. We're going to call up the chess computer engine, and it'll help us analyze what happens after rook to c5. Yeah, rook to d1 check, that's the move. Rook here. King to f2. Then the other rook down. And then king to e3. And we do the check. We get the queen. And it's with check, and then black picks the rook up on c5. So rook to c5 doesn't work out. It looked like a good threat, but it doesn't actually work out. So black was perfectly safe when he gave back the bishop, because rook to c5 doesn't work because of the rooks down and then the check on the king and queen. So white has to take with the pawn. Notice the pawn's protected sufficiently with the rook and the queen, and black can't take the c4 pawn because we would have rook to c5 check. And now we do threaten rook to c5. So in this case, black just moves his king out of the way. White plays queen to d3, which I have a note is not the best move, because it allows rook takes pawn. Yeah, it lost a pawn. So the reason queen to d3 is a mistake. It looks like the queen and rook protect the pawn, but white forgot that if the rook on d5 moves, there's a checkmate on g2. So queen to d3 is a mistake because it loses the pawn to rook takes pawn. White can still hold on though, but now it's going to be a draw. He retreats here, so the queen guards the checkmate square, and white threatens rook takes rook. Black liquidates the rook. Pawn takes the rook. The queen goes to c5 with check. Notice that the queen did not block the pawn. That would be a mistake. So there's 2, 4, 6 black pawns, 2, 4, 6 white pawns. Material-wise, it ought to be a draw. That white pawn that passed pawn has to be neutralized by black. So black's going to put his queen here with check. Then he has time to bring his king up, and the king and queen block the pawn from advancing. And the king can move to d6, and then the queen and king can win that pawn. White doesn't have time to move his king up to defend the pawn. White might be feeling a little trouble here, but he has a resource. So king to c7, b3, king to d6. So now black is threatening to win the pawn, and he would be a pawn up. There might be winning chances because he might win the king and pawn ending. White would have to trade queens because of that threat down to g2, plus the black queen could go to h1 check. King moves and queen takes rook pawn check. So white counterattacks. He gives up on the d5 pawn, but he sees he can take the f6 pawn with check on the king. So Naturally, queen takes pawn doesn't work for black because there's that queen takes pawn check. So he takes with the king. The queen takes the pawn. Now, this looks like it could be a draw because we have 5 pawns on each side. It's simply a case that white can maybe get a perpetual check. See how the black king's in the middle of the board. Whites can probably get perpetual check and get a draw that way. Or white might be able to trade queens and the king could hold the ending. We'll see how it goes. This is the black's attempt to win. He's going to try to bring his king in, and king and queen are going to attack white's pawns and the white king. So here's a check. King to d4, queen to d7 check, king to e3. So the king is right here, and he blocks these squares, and the threat is queen here, checkmate. So he can't take the pawn. This would be checkmate. He has to keep checking the king, and that works for white. So he plays queen to e6, king to d4, king to e3, queen to e6, king to d2. He's going to try to come over here and win these pawns. Check. Okay, now this king is not here, so there's no checkmate threat against the king, so he can afford to take the pawn way over here, and he's threatening once he wins this pawn, there'll be no checkmate down here, and he has a safe draw. So he's hoping to win this pawn and secure the draw. Just a few more moves. King comes down. The king is going to wipe these pawns out, and black's hoping he can shove this pawn and get a queen before white can do damage on the other side of the board. So white takes the dangerous pawn. Black takes that pawn. Now, white counterattacks on this pawn and this pawn at the same time. Naturally, if king takes pawn, he's going to take that pawn with check, and then he can win this pawn. And black plays queen to c6. Black plays queen to c6, saving both pawns, and then he can do king takes pawn. The only way white can protect this pawn, how can white protect this pawn in the audience? Queen to f7. But what is the queen protecting in his own position from h7? The h2 pawn. So if queen to f7, this pawn's unprotected, and the queen can drop down here, forcing the king here, and then his queen takes pawn check, and this pawn falls, and it's all over. So actually white resigned here. Now white could have played better and gotten a draw. Let's see. Remember I told you here, we were here, and white made a bad move and lost that pawn because of queen down there checkmate. Here's what let's see what white should have played. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so the computer says this is, I don't know if you're familiar with how these work, but this is the name of the computer, Fritz, and 11 is the version, Fritz 11. And they do an evaluation based on 1.00 is 1 pawn's worth. So generally speaking, a grandmaster can win with one pawn. So the numeric evaluation, see how it's 0.00? Dead even. Equals means the computer says it should be a draw with best play by both sides. Okay, so he says white should play queen to b4. And we won't go into this in any detail, but I just make the one move. Look at change to a big plus for white, 0.79. I wonder why that's the case. Okay, I didn't give it enough time. It changed its evaluation. So it says white has a big advantage. It's more than half a pawn. It's a pawn and it's like 3/4 of a pawn, almost 0.75. That's almost enough to win, and the plus over minus means it's a big advantage. The right move for white is queen to b4, and white might have winning chances, but again, in this position, white blundered queen to d3. That's what the question mark is. It's a mistake, and it allowed black to win the pawn. And white couldn't do rook takes rook because there was queen to g2 checkmate. And black actually went on to win the game. This is similar to the last one, but let's look at this position. It's white's move. White wants to advance this pawn and attack with these 4 pawns the black king position. So white starts off with e4. Now, remember, in the topic is the advanced pawn and how, in this case, you don't win with it, but you can save the day. So what should black do with his pawn on h4? h3. Same as in our last example. It breaks up the white pawns around the king and gives black counterattacks where he can infiltrate with his queen and try to get to the g2 square. So again, white pushes the pawn up. Now black brings his knight to d6, and black is threatening knight takes pawn. But it looks like knight to d6 is a blunder, doesn't it? It looks to me like white could fork the knight and queen with that pawn on e4. So the question is, that's what's going to happen, but what should black do? Well, we know black wants to get his queen to g2, so black is going to move his queen to the white square next and come into e4 after the pawn takes the knight, and then the queen will threaten queen to g2 checkmate. Does everybody see that possibility?
Wait, so queen to d4?
Well, let me do the move. e5, winning the knight. See, but it opens up that white diagonal. You see that? So now the queen, you don't move, the queen has to move, but you move it to the white square, and you get the queen targeting going to square where he can go queen to g2 and threaten checkmate. It saves the day. So white takes the knight, but now we're in the position that I started with by mistake, and the threat is queen here, and the move, as you said, is rook to f2, the only move to stop checkmate. Notice that the queen here would protect it, but the black queen guards the square, so you can't drop the queen back. And there's no other pieces that could guard the g2 square. So he has to do rook up, but now there's perpetual check. The king can't move, so the rook has to drop back. Well, it's not perpetual check, but it's like perpetual check. It's the threat of mate. Rook has to go up, check, threat of mate. It's similar to a perpetual check. So you should keep in mind in your own games that advanced pawns can give you either attacking chances or counterattacking chances. Okay, let's go to our next. Now we're going to go to another topic. This one is called the point Queen Knight 6 as a target. The subject is Queen Knight 6 as a target. And black is actually going to win the game. And black, this is the English notation, this is the Queen Knight file. Black's Queen Knight 6 is this square. We're not ready to attack this square. There's nothing to attack it. So we got to play through some moves to set this up. And we'll go through it pretty quickly. So white plays b3. That's going to be our target. Black brings his rook up. He's going to double rooks maybe and maybe open up that knight file by pawn takes pawn. White plays h3 to give his king an escape hole, king to h2. Black moves his king over to the corner. He doesn't want to be checked on those white diagonals. White retreated his bishop. White's thinking about playing the pawn on g2 to g4 to attack the black pawn on f5. The bishop reroutes itself from e7 where the knight can take the bishop. He's going to bring guard the black diagonals. He doesn't want to lose his bishop. White does play the g4 move. Black defends with the queen. Queen moves to f3. I have a note that that's not the best move. The best move is moving the bishop back to g3. Okay, so going back a little bit, the bishop went to h2. Not that h2 is a good square for the bishop. He wanted to stop blocking the pawn so he could attack with the pawn here. Having moved the pawn here, he should have moved the bishop back behind the pawn to give the bishop more squares to go to in the future. He didn't do that. Okay. So right here, he should have left the queen here where it blocks this pawn and protects this pawn, and he should have moved the bishop here. Anyway, now black has a slight advantage. Black plays rook to a7. White plays g5, b4. So black blocks this pawn with this pawn, and now black is going to move here and here. And when the pawn gets here, we have our attack on our b6, our queen knight 6 square, or the b3 square, which is our topic, how you can attack this square. So this is not a kingside attack. Black is going to attack with his rooks and win a pawn. This pawn's going to come up here. He's going to take here, here. When this pawn is here, see how it's not defended by any pawns? Then the rooks can come in, and the queen can come in and maybe win the pawn way down the road. So black plays bishop to g3, a5, h4, a4. So there's our attack. White plays the rook over this way. He wants to move this pawn up and attack with his pawns. Black trades pawns. As I said, this pawn is weak. It's not protected by any other pawns, and black can come here or here and here and maybe bring the queen down here and here, and then the rook and queen can attack the pawn, maybe try to win it. That's what black's going to try to do. Black plays rook to a3, bishop to f2. The queen protects the pawn for the time being. Now black brings his queen over. White moves the rook up, so now he's got rook and queen protecting the pawn. But notice these are open for the black rook and queen. Black drops down check. King goes up to the escape hole. Black swings his rook over. White wants to trade rooks to ease his defense. Black doesn't want to trade rooks, so he moves there. The bishop drops back. Now white wants to trade the rook on g2 to that rook. The queen comes down. White trades the rook. Now the king goes up. The rook goes to f7. See how the rook is blocked by his bishop? He can't move the bishop up because the knight guards all the squares, so he's going to move. He wants the rook to come to the a file, so he has to go up one square, then he can go over. White plays queen to d3, g6. Before the rook moves, he had to protect the pawn on f5 with the pawn so he could move the rook. If the rook moved right away, the answer would be queen takes pawn, threatening queen takes knight. So g6, rook to d2, he wants to chase the queen away. Queen goes to a1, attacking the bishop on e1. Rook has to go back. Queen retreats. The queen retreats all the way here because when the rook comes over, he wants his queen behind the rook. He's going to jump into white's position rook first. That's why he put the queen all the way back on the first row. White plays a... So now the rook comes to a7. Queen moves, rook in. White makes an error here, rook to d3, but queen to d3 would have been a better defense. Anyway, after rook to d3, he gets into more trouble. Black swings his rook to b2, attacking the pawn and making room for the queen to come here or here. Black retreats, white retreats the bishop. Now the queen comes in, attacks the bishop. Okay, now the queen comes over this way. The queen's going to come here and attack the bishop, and then the queen and rook are going to be on this pawn. White tries to chase the queen away. Goes back here. Now black sees he can maybe win the game after he trades queens because the queen is a strong defender. White trades queens. He moves his king in, chase the rook. The rook goes to b2, and he's on this pawn. It's defended by this rook. The question is, what piece can black move to attack this pawn? The rook is in the right spot. What other piece can black move to attack that pawn? Would the audience care to hazard a guess? Has to be the knight. This is a white pawn on a white square. That black square bishop's not going to do the trick. So he's going to move the knight around like knight here, 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 and here, and then the knight and rook attack the pawn, and the bishop can't defend the pawn, and the king can't cross this line. There's no defense, and white wins. Okay. Now we're going to go over another example. This time the topic is queen bishop 6 as a target. Only one example here. Yeah, this is the starting position. Now white wins this. So the topic is queen bishop 6, again in English notation. This is the queen bishop square, and this is the white 6th row. So this is queen bishop 6. The target of our attack is this pawn. White is going to attack this pawn and try to win on the queen side. He's going to move the pawn here to block the pawn. Then he's going to advance this pawn here, this pawn here, attacking this pawn. Then he can do pawn takes, and bring his rooks in. Something like that. So we'll go through this pretty quickly. There's a number of moves before we get to the critical position. So he chases the queen away. The queen has to go back to her home square. Now we have the b4 pawn coming up. Moves the knight out of the way. h3, that's... Why did white play h3? Who in the audience would care to give us the reason for that?
Block the knight and give the king the escape route.
That's true, and there's one other reason. He wants to give the bishop an escape square. He doesn't want the knight to go here and liquidate the bishop. This bishop is very strong. See how it goes all the way here and prevents the rook? Or the queen can't go here and the rook can't go here. He wants to preserve this bishop at all costs. So the main purpose of the move is to give the bishop a retreat square in case black plays knight here. The other things you mentioned are true too. In the ending, he can move his king up in case black should somehow get to the back row. And it does block the knight from coming into g4 too. Black plays bishop to d7. Now white, see, he's commencing his pawn attack on the queen side. Black plays queen to c8. White gets his pawn up there. Now you can see he is in fact initiating a direct attack on that pawn. We still got about 15 moves to go. Black plays there. Now, black should only have played this move if this pawn was here. Then he could take the bishop, and if the bishop moved here, he could take the bishop here. There's no purpose to this move. The bishop retreats here, and this knight is on the side of the board. It's on a bad square. So this is a mistake. Bishop retreats. Black retreats his bishop. Now, white is going to attack with this pawn, and he's going to shove it up here. So these two white pawns attack here, and he breaks down black's defenses. Black plays bishop to c7. This bishop was really bugging black, so he moved the bishop back in here to liquidate. Then he can move his queen here and the rook there for defense. Well, white's going to lose the bishop. He doesn't want to let bishop takes bishop check, so he just takes it. Queen takes. Now we're at the culmination of white's queenside attack. He attacks this pawn, and he threatens something like pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. This rook comes here and it attacks the queen, and the two rooks here and the queen, this is an isolated pawn. White's going to bring the queen up, then he'll threaten rook down, and he should win the game. Black played b6. He didn't want to allow pawn takes pawn. This doesn't work out that well. I've got to note that that's a mistake. White takes advantage of it by taking at c6. So, see how the pawns black played here. Now we liquidate the pawn, and c6 is going to have a bishop or a queen there. Naturally, he takes with the bishop. Now we take the b6 pawn. Black has a choice. It can take with the queen or the pawn. What's the drawback in taking with the pawn? Who in the audience would care to say what the drawback is?
Knight b5.
Yeah, knight to b5. The other thing is, yeah, that's very strong because the bishop's pinned. Pawn takes pawn. This becomes a passed pawn and can be shoved up and get a queen. So he has to do queen takes pawn. And your idea of knight to knight 5 is a very strong move too. So he has to take with the queen, but the drawback to the queen is we can activate our rook that's not doing anything behind the pawn, we can swing it over here and win a tempo attacking the queen. Drive the queen back. Now the knight comes in with tempo attacking the bishop that's unprotected. So now we got our knight on the key center square. Our rooks are on here, the queen's here. Black's days are numbered. He has to retreat the bishop. White chooses to take the bishop because the bishop guards key squares on the queen side. Black takes back. Oh, okay, let's look at this position just a smidgen longer. So white did knight takes. He has two choices, knight or queen takes. What's wrong with queen takes knight? Yes, bishop to b5, attacking the queen moves and the rook's gone. So you can't do that. But there's a big drawback to taking with the knight. What was the knight protecting on f8? h7. So white wins a key pawn. Where is it? Where is it? Right here. There. Bishop takes 8. This is enough to win the game now. We're a pawn up. Black's king side is bad. His knight is on the side on h5. White dominates the queen side. So the king moves over. White prudently pulls the bishop back. He doesn't want to mess around with the g6 blocking the bishop in. Black moves his knight to b6. White immediately attacks the knight. This is Black's defender. It blocks this rook. And the rook wants to go here. So he immediately comes here. The knight, once he gets rid of that knight, he can threaten rook down to the 7th rank. Black has nothing better than knight takes, queen takes. He tries to defend b7 with the rook. Rook drops in anyway. If black does rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, we have a passed pawn and it attacks the rook moves and we get queen takes rook pawn. So he can't do rook takes rook. He tries rook to c8. Now we double rooks. Again, rook takes rook doesn't work for black because pawn takes rook. So he just tries to double rooks. But now, queen takes. If he does rook takes, it would probably be the same thing. Rook to b7 would probably win. And if rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, we'd have that passed pawn, and the white queen would be able to either take the pawn on a7. So if rook takes, rook here, rook takes, pawn takes, if queen here, we would have queen here check, and queen takes pawn attacking the knight. So the only move he can try is queen takes c7, but now we get our rook in. We're attacking the queen and the pawn on a7 at the same time. He tries to counterattack with a check, but we have our escape hole, which you pointed out. Now he goes queen to d2. He tries to attack the bishop. But white is done with defending. He's got the rook on the 7th rank. All he has to do is bring a queen and attack this way, and the game will be over in just a couple moves. So he doesn't defend the bishop or move it. Threatening queen takes rook. Rook to f8 to defend the pawn. Who sees the winning move? One more move for white. Queen takes pawn. Very good. And because the bishop guards the escape hole, rook takes queen, rook here check, rook back, rook takes rook checkmate. And it's all over. And he can't protect the checkmate by rook here because his knight's hanging. Queen takes knight would be checkmate. And we're out of time, so that's it. Thanks for coming tonight.